And that's how we see innovation, right? Innovation is like taking different inventions from various fields, combining together, and then using it for a different use case. And that's what we're doing here.
Hello, and welcome to our latest episode of Just Another Space Podcast. I'm Tom Culligan, here with my co-host, as always, Clayton Swope, and our special guest today, Winnie Lai, the founder and CEO of Auriga Space. Winnie, welcome, and thanks for being on the show with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, our pleasure. So we've been going back and forth as followers of the show know. We kind of do an industry CEO, and then we have a government leader. So glad to be back with a really interesting CEO this week, talking about how you founded the company. But we always like to start with, how did you get here? What's your background? Were you always a passion about space, or did you fall into it?
For sure. Happy to talk about that, my background. I've been in love with space ever since I was a little girl. I used to, sit in my bedroom with my dad talking about planets, talking about rockets, talking about human
Did you talk
survival.
about Pluto or when
Oh,
or it was
oh yeah,
Pluto?
oh,
It was out.
absolutely.
Okay, because
Pluto
we had
was
another episode where we
back in
said
the days.
there's
Yes,
definitely a ninth
absolutely.
planet, and if there needs
Yes,
to be one more executive order on President Trump's list, we think it should be restoring planet status to Pluto. So
100%.
sorry to interrupt you, but I
Oh,
just
no
wanted to make
problem. Yeah.
sure
That's
you're
a full
part of
endorsement of Pluto. That's
you're part of
incredible.
the
Yeah,
nine,
Exactly.
you're
Yep,
the
you're in good
that there
exactly.
are
company.
Pluto has
nine.
my vote. Pluto has my vote for sure. So yes, I've been a space nerd ever since I was a kid. So I knew that growing up, I wanted to be in aerospace. I wanted to be an engineer. So when I got to college, I studied engineering physics and hoping that I would become a rocket scientist one day. But as they like to say, life isn't always a straight path, right? So I graduated when at the peak of the tech boom. So people worked in tech, and that's what I did. I graduated, and then I actually started my own company in tech, raised funding, love starting businesses, and I was involved with several tech startups, which are successful. I've had two tech exits, and then after that, I decided that I wanted to do something that was, first of all, like more meaningful. I wanted to do something with long-lasting impact on society. I also wanted to follow my passion. My passion as a kid, work in the space industry. So I pivoted in my career from tech into space, and I joined Spin Launch back in the early days. At Spin Launch, I was heading up business development as well as product development. Got to see the company grow. It was very exciting for me. I love what I was doing. I wanted to continue. So after I left Spin Launch, I wanted to start another company, and it just made sense for me to combine my passion for space, as well as my entrepreneurial experience. So founded Auriga Space back in 2022.
What's the hardest part in your mind, the business side or the engineering, the technical side? Because I think I have a mechanical engineering background. I know nothing about business. Engineering is very hard. I do recognize that, but I don't know how hard the business side is. And hearing that you did that and you have the technical side, I feel like maybe you can compare them.
For sure. That's a good question. I've never been asked that before. In reality, I think both are hard. Building a successful business is hard, irrespective, right? But also, the technology that we're working with is also difficult. But that being said, I really love it. I'm also very fortunate that I have a very strong technical team, technical leads. I still participate in the technical discussions. I don't do the technical work. You don't want me doing the technical work, put it that way. But, I love participating in the whiteboarding sessions. And I think it gives me life. But also at the same time, like it allows me to build, realistic perspective to guide the business.
Right. What's possible?
Exactly. What's
Yeah, I
possible?
feel the same way. I don't think I could do any algebra, let alone calculus at this point. But I do feel like when I see technical things written on a whiteboard, I have a little bit of an understanding and can maybe call BS on that.
Exactly. Or also be able to suggest either ideas, like know when we are, going down the wrong path, like, or we need to reframe our thinking. And then also finally, I think, just like understanding timelines. So that's also really important as well.
Yeah.
Like when you're a CEO and when you're running a business, like you also need to understand timelines. And what I mean timeline, I mean realistic timelines, right? So yeah, I love the team. They're great, but also at the same time, like I'm able to kind of bridge both sides, like, between the business and also the technical aspect.
So can I ask, like, again, as the non-engineer on the call here, so I will ask the dumb questions for that side of our non-technical audience. How was it making the switch from, I imagine when you were working in tech, it was largely software focused, and now you're predominantly, I know there's a software component to everything and digital twins and stuff like that, but predominantly hardware. Was that actually a hard adjustment to make?
You know what? I think about that a lot. I think about a lot about how can I take the lessons I've learned in software to hardware. I think fundamentally, building a business is building a business, right? It doesn't matter whether you're offering a software product, a hardware product, or a services. At the end of the day, you're here to make a company profitable and successful. But that being said, I think I've learned a lot from software in the sense like of like agile development, right? In agile development, we move quickly, we iterate, and we see what works, what doesn't work, and we iterate, right? I've been able to bring that into hardware. I was actually in product management when I was in the software, so got to oversee the product roadmap, got to run sprints, and we apply the same methodology here at Auriga, even though yes, like we're building a hardware product. I'd like to say though that with hardware, like with software, if you make a mistake, you can always press Control Z or go back to a different repo, like easy, right? But with hardware, you really can't mess up because the cost of messing up can be expensive. So what we like to do is like just like measure twice, cut once. So that's the framework.
Yeah.
And tell us what Auriga does. I just realized Tom and I know, and you probably know, Winnie, but just in case the other folks don't, you're
Yeah.
building hardware. We did establish that.
Exactly. Yeah. So let me elaborate because we talked a bit about my time at Spin Launch, and Spin Launch is a kinetic space launch company. So building an alternative way of getting to space.
So what's the main way? Tell us what the main way is.
So at Auriga, we're developing a electromagnetic launcher. So it's an alternative way of getting to space that doesn't involve traditional rockets. If you look at a traditional rocket, it's staged, right? There's a big rocket, and then on top of that, there's a small rocket. On top of that, it's a small rocket, right? So what we're looking to do at Auriga is eliminate the first stage of a rocket and replacing that with a ground-based launcher. It's powered by electricity, so we're converting electricity into mechanical motion. And the way we're doing that is, very similar to the Japanese maglev train, right? So it uses electricity to generate magnetic forces, magnetic field, sorry, which then translates into motion. So it's an electric motor, and instead of a rotary electric motor that you see in your Tesla or electric car, this is a linear motor.
And this is how they launch aircraft off the Ford-class carriers, too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, exactly. Yep. So EMALS, the electromagnetic aircraft launchers, this technology has been demonstrated and proven in other industries. And what we're doing is we're bringing that technology to space launch. And why that's important is we can, by having a fully reusable first stage, we can bring down launch costs. And then second of all, because we're no longer dealing with a massive rocket structure, we can launch a lot quicker, right? So we can launch on demand at the same time bring down.
What's the size of the facility, just to give us a sense of scale? And then maybe compare it to just what that footprint would look like for that more traditional approach using all rockets, including the first stage.
For sure, exactly. So, in terms of, the size of a facility, I guess the way to think about it is like it's going to be like a train track, right? It's going to be long and skinny. Now, how long it's going to be, it's still like to be determined. We are still in our initial designs, but what we're looking at is about like 6 mile long.
Wow.
Wow, that's long.
Yeah, it's long. It's long. And the reason why we want to do that is, we want to control the acceleration so that we can accelerate without damaging the payloads. Now, some
Oh,
payloads
yeah.
are
Yeah.
sensitive to others, right? Especially if we talk about some of the work that's been done in missile defense, like those projectiles accelerate a much, much higher rate, right? So there's an opportunity for us to shorten that footprint. But to put things into comparison, if you look at what's been built in Japan, I mean, the plan is to go from like Tokyo to Osaka, and that's like 175 miles long, right? I think about 27 miles of that has been built. So we're talking about like a fraction of what's been constructed.
So that technology is really there. You're just applying it in a different way.
Exactly. Yep. And that's how we see innovation, right? Innovation is like taking different inventions from various fields, combining together, and then using it for a different use case. And that's what we're doing here. Yeah.
It would be like on a ramp. Like, is that how that would work? Like kind
Yeah.
of 6 miles, just a little elevating, like a that when you're on the roller coaster and you're getting to the peak of the hill, that you just never go down, you just keep going off into the distance. That's kind of the thought.
Exactly. Yeah, so, like, we would like to call, like, a little ski jump.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And what's interesting is that, you talked about the EMALs previously, and like the Chinese and Russians actually have a little ski jump at the end on their aircraft carriers, and that's to facilitate the upward motion.
Okay.
So, it's interesting. You think back throughout history, there's always been this desire to get off like chemical rockets. I feel like, and I remember as a staffer on Capitol Hill, you'd have people come be like, we got to have space elevators. That's going to be the future. And then, a few years ago, as you mentioned, when you joined Spin Launch, it's, hey, we're going to start thinking about different kinetic ways to do this. And so I don't mean to lump you in with space elevators or other things, but it's interesting that there seems to have always been this sort of bleeding edge on the technology front of people saying, you're not going to get to sort of a sustainable transportation capability, at least for a certain class of payload, until you find a non-chemical launch like solution. Is that really the premise of this is like the best technology we have today to get there?
Yeah, and I always say like we're not the first to do this, right? Back in the '60s, there's the Project HARP, the High Altitude Research Project. It was a joint effort between the U.S. Army as well as McGill University in Canada. And what they've built is like a gigantic cannon to launch payloads into space, and they've gotten as high as 181 kilometers. So it's not quite like it didn't make it into orbit, but it did pass the Kármán line. And I think with further funding, like, they could have achieved space access. But this was in the '60s, so at the same time, this was when the Apollo program was taken off. So as you can imagine, like the funding was also diverted towards some of these larger programs.
So they went higher than the space tourists on Virgin and Blue, I take it.
Yes, yes. With those, what do you call it? I think now there's a term for those passengers, which are like suborbital astronauts. I think
That's
that's what
right.
you
Yeah.
want to call them instead of astronaut, or you call them like suborbital astronauts. Yeah.
I just call them very wealthy and high visibility people.
Right. Exactly. Or just well connected. Hey, but that being said, right, I would love the opportunity to go into space. So yeah. So I'll leave it at that.
That's okay. So another question on this, again, non-engineer here, but I'm going to ask the dumb questions for my poli-sci side of the audience. One of the things that I always with Spin Launch back in the day, and so I'll put it to you too, is there are certain things where I feel like that application plays well, but you're probably not going to be, at least in the foreseeable future, be able to launch humans, suborbital or orbital with that technology, right? Because of the way the G forces would, yeah.
Correct. Yeah, and I gotta say, like, it's not a company priority to launch humans. I love people, but at the same time, you know what? They can be a pain in the butt, right? So,
Especially the rich tourists.
yeah. So,
Sure, they're
so
very demanding.
exactly, yeah. So we want to focus on assets, payloads. But that being said, like one day when there are humans, space tourism takes off, right? They're gonna need supplies, and we'd be more than happy to supply them with caviar,
Champagne would make the journey, like the delicate bubbles and bottles.
exactly.
That might be really explosive when you open it, those
Yeah, yeah.
G-force. Same if it's the beer. Be careful.
Model. Like, so what is the business case? Like, is it Electron class payloads? Is it sub? I'm trying to think about where we are in the ecosystem today with the various, I imagine on the smaller launch end. Where do you all fit into that?
Good question. And we're going to be scaling our technology over time. So even like, with SpaceX, it started off with the Falcon 1, and then moved to Falcon 9, and now there's Starship, right? So we want to take on that model as well. We're going to start off with small payloads. In fact, we're talking to Space Force initially just about like delivering fuel into space. Fuel, as you can imagine, is quite a highly sought after commodity, being able to support maneuvers in space for a variety of reasons. So, that could be our initial go-to-market, and then we can scale that up to CubeSats, and then eventually, we'll want to get to be able to launch Astra Grande-sized satellites. So, look, we're not going to be launching a bunch of satellites at once. That's not our business model, but our business model is very much like, the FedEx, right, or the Uber, being able to launch whenever and wherever. So it's going to be a dedicated launch system.
Well, and I think too, like I think about beyond even you mentioned some of the Space Force interests and maybe some of the commercial ones, but my mind goes to some of like the university science research, some of the NIH, NSF, NASA, like that seems to be a market that you really need affordable, frequent as, student and PI experiments are ready. Is that something y'all are looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, science experiments could be a customer of ours. Right now, we're just more focused on defense applications as well as, commercial customers. We are working with several universities on more on the hypersonics development right now. That's another like immediate focus of ours. We see those as lily pads, to get into our ultimate goal.
Now, your first stage must depart Earth, or at least the ground, at a much higher rate of speed than a traditional rocket, right? Like, how fast are you going off the ski jump?
For sure. So right now we're targeting about 6 times the speed of sound. So to put into context, I don't like to bring this up, but it was the railgun. We're not building a railgun here. Although fundamentally we are converting electricity into mechanical motion. So that's a similarity. But in terms of like what's been previously done, I mean like the railguns launch over 8 times, 9 times the speed of sound, and like, we're fortunate enough to have seen it in person and actually press the launch button on it. So pretty impressive.
That's cool.
What's do you think with the you said 6 mile or 6 kilometer? 6 mile.
No, no. Oh, you mean the length?
The
Yes.
length, yeah. So
Yes.
with that first generation, the 6 mile one, what would be like the turnaround time? So you launch a payload into space. Would the next one launch within like minutes or hours or days or just not sure yet?
Yeah, at this point, like, we're targeting, an hour, right?
Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, the way
That's limitation is energy, is that point, or is it
access
just the
to power.
reloading? Okay.
So, we trickle charge, a temporary, energy storage bank, and after that's charged up, then we can launch, right? So at the end of the day, we wanna see this as run like train work, and it's a important capability for the country, being able to reconstitute satellites on moment's notice.
Yep.
There's also been interest in launching reconnaissance satellites on, again, like on demand. If we see something that is suspicious up there that could pose a threat to our assets in space, like we want to find out what's going on, and this could be a good way to launch a reconnaissance satellite very quickly.
So is that do you think the benefit of your approach, the speed of the cadence that you could operate a system like this, or is costs per kilogram, is that also an advantage or not necessarily as important as the speed piece?
And you know what? It depends on the customer, right? Different customers have different pain points that we're solving. So on the commercial side, it's definitely price. Price is like the main driver.
Okay, so and you're thinking we could do something at a competitive price.
For sure. I mean, like, just for example, like if as of April 2025, right, the price of a SpaceX transporter mission is $6,500 per kilogram, right? So if you're talking about launching a 200 kilogram satellite, you're talking about like $1.3 million just to get one satellite into space. Right, so it's a big number. It's a big number, and also, considering that you rarely launch just one satellite, right? You launch a constellation of satellites that work together to provide some sort of services. So, as you can imagine, for the commercial customer, that's very price sensitive. They're certainly looking for ways to lower that. And but then for defense, Space Force has a different agenda, and DoD views space as critical to national security. We rely on space assets to provide us with intelligence information, navigation, like GPS, as well as telecommunication. So having access to space on moment's notice is incredibly important for DoD, and that's where we play, right? For commercial customers, definitely lowering the cost per launch, and then for our DoD customers, it's certainly increasing the launch cadence and also the responsiveness.
Yeah, I can think of a lot of military DoD use cases, and I think we first met maybe a year and a half ago. A lot has changed. The one that comes to mind right away that could potentially be a large constellation that will need a lot of fuel or propellant is something like Golden Dome for space-based interceptors. I think not only whatever that contraption looks like that does the intercept, but it's going to need a lot of fuel because it's going to have to burn really hard to hit that course in the boost phase, hit that missile in the boost phase of its trajectory. So to me, capability, when you said launching fuel, I immediately thought, wow, that would be an interesting way to effectively launch modules of propellant that could then support a persistent constellation of space-based interceptors, aka Golden Dome. And I'm not sure if that's what DoD is thinking, but to me, that was one thing that I thought of. I also thought immediately of things like rocket cargo or something, that would, I would say more broadly, space mobility. So the ability to send things not just into space, so not just space access, but through space somewhere else, and to do that very quickly. You could even have something like a reentry capsule on whatever you're launching. I'm thinking what one of our most recent podcasts had one of the Varda co-founders on. So I'm thinking, wow, you could just put that on the end of this, and if you could launch those every hour, that's a lot of stuff. You could move. So I'm sure you're thinking about all these things, but I'm very happy to hear that DoD is engaging. I think where I'll kind of put the question here is just how are they engaging with you? Are they, there's different ways that DoD, I feel like, can indicate they want to buy something. They can, use StratFi to invest. There's organizations like InQtel. So what does that relationship look like right now for you with DoD?
Absolutely. And like, I'm glad that you brought up the various use cases of our electromagnetic launch technology. We've been talking about, space launch, but also that being said, like there are other defense initiatives that we are or could be supporting.
Right.
Exactly. So hypersonic testing is like
Oh, right.
one of the early customers, and tracking that we've had. We have a direct to phase two SBI with Air Force and Air Force Research Lab, to support them in testing. And we have test articles identified, even though we're currently under construction for our hypersonic test facility. And same goes for some of the large primes as well. Like there's other test articles that we can test out more immediately. But yeah, going back to your point about Golden Dome, it's a very interesting opportunity. It's new. Although, let me take it back. It's not new in the sense that, hey,
Right.
this
It's not.
concept has been
Right.
around since I think the 80s, like with SDI, with the Strategic Defense Initiatives back in the Reagan days. It's a very interesting concept. We're keeping a close eye on it. We've had engagements with a Missile Defense Agency on our ability to support them in boost phase intercept, as well as just intercept in general, like period.
Right.
If you look at it, like what we are providing, the type of service that we're providing is either an elimination or a reduction in our reliance on rocket motors.
Right. You're right. It doesn't have to be anything with space-based boost phase. You're right. It doesn't even have to
Exactly.
be space-based. It could be mid-course or um, terminal phase too. You're right.
Exactly. Yep. So that's what's interesting, about our technology is like it can be applied for multiple use cases. And of course, as we continue to develop our technology and as we have the capability to go, further and further out in space, like we are also like keep an eye out on lunar launch. Right. There are now companies developing technology to mine the moon, either helium-3 or water or other like critical minerals. And guess what? Like, they're gonna need a way to bring back all those assets. And then we see ourselves as a potential contributor to bring back these assets low cost, right? And also with a minimal maintenance.
And for those types of lunar activities, you tell us what you're thinking. You're thinking effectively you would have this 6 mile long railroad on the moon to launch things back. Is that what you mean by moving the material back from the moon?
For sure. Yeah. So, the 6 mile long number is still like
Sorry, not to box you in on that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, no,
Just I
exactly. Yeah.
guess I'm just visualizing it. I'm just helping our audience visualize the scale, but I'm not in a bad way, just so they know like what we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And like with other applications, as we talked about, like, Golden Dome, like for sure, like we're not going to have like a 6 mile long launch system and we can make it a lot more compact. The only thing that it affects is like the acceleration on the payload. Now, space-based assets like satellites are more fragile. So therefore, we want to keep our acceleration forces low. But now if we talk about bringing back, rocks, moon
Oh, you're
rocks.
right. Yeah, the lunar
Yeah,
regolith. It's not particularly sensitive to the G forces. No, I
Yeah,
see what you
yeah,
mean.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
So we can
Or
get a
platinum group metals. Who
yeah,
knows?
yeah, yeah.
Whatever we're bringing back,
Whatever.
those
Exactly.
don't care. Those
I
don't
don't
care
know,
about.
little tiny little aliens. I'm not sure.
bottles of helium-3, right?
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
Actually, so propellant wouldn't necessarily be sensitive to G forces either, right?
Exactly, and that's why, like, when for our initial our engagement with the Space Force, one of the, initial use cases that they're looking, for is, like, propellant,
That
right?
makes
Launching
sense.
space. And it's not just, like, for missile defense, but even, like, for satellites, right?
Right.
Satellites to do maneuvers, like, to be able to dodge ASATs or like anti-satellite weapons or lasers, whatever it may be, other threats. They need fuel. They need to expand fuel to move. And that's another use case, for our technology is the rapid delivery of fuel.
And I imagine returning stuff from the moon, you don't need the same amount of energy, right? Like you really just got to escape the
Oh, you're
minimal
right. Yeah,
gravity.
you're right.
So
Yep, that's a
yeah,
good point too. So, like on the moon, talking about 1/6 of the gravity is on Earth. So yes, so it can be a small system as well,
could be a mile, just to put it in
or even
Clayton's.
shorter, like really shorter.
A literal ski jump. A literal ski
A
jump.
just a little push.
Yeah,
I've seen those golf balls from the Apollo missions. They left without much force, and they're still probably moving.
So I think I mean, one of the things that's kind of cool about the moment right now is that, you see the DoD and others willing to sort of look beyond traditional concepts and obviously like working with you all on kind of these demonstration ideas about like fuel in space and stuff like that. Have you, in the time since you started, Riga, you said it was like 21, 22 timeframe, have you found the government to be like really receptive and supportive of through, I don't know, DIU or DARPA or other kind of demonstration activities?
for sure. And I think the landscape has changed a lot, right? And we are grateful for that change because there's certainly a change in mentality towards like adopting new technologies and the willingness to work with smaller companies. So we're very thankful that there are R&D like programs like like the SBIRs, the TACFI, StratFIs, and also DIUs. So they have a framework for new companies to work with the DoD, right? To essentially transition their technology. Besides funding, another thing that I found to be very important is just gathering requirements from end users. From DoD end users, like as a company, like we need to know what the DoD is looking for, and by being part of these programs, you get the opportunity to talk to like end users, prospective customers, understand like what their pain points are, understand like, hey, what's important to them, like what are the requirements, so that as we continue to develop a technology, we can build in these requirements into our roadmap. And if I have a magic wand, right, I would love to see the administration as well as like DoD continue to lean in on these programs that spur innovation. I think if you look at what's going on abroad, like what China is, like China, like spend a lot on subsidies. So they subsidize research and development to private companies, and in order for us to keep up with technology development and maintain our lead, we would like the government to continue to lean in on that. So that's one thing. And then another thing I will add is in other industries, like in commercial, right? There's usually what's called like purchase agreements, right? If the company delivers X,
Yeah.
then the customer will buy units at Z price. If the government can do that like earlier on, that would be helpful, right? And not to say they don't do that. Like once you get to a phase 3, they will do that, but it's just also like ensuring that the company survives to get there.
Yeah, actually,
And
I want to jump on that
oh,
bandwagon
sure,
because I
yeah.
feel like the government is not a good buyer, and sometimes they try to solve that problem by doing programs that provide investment early on. So I think the way I look at it is if you buy a house and you have help to pay the down payment,
Mhm. Yeah.
but then ultimately you still can't afford the monthly mortgage, that doesn't help anyone. So how this applies in this scenario is that sometimes I see certain programs, particularly within DoD, that try to provide you with that funding up front so that your business, quote unquote, survives or get over the valley of death. But then once you're over that valley of death on the other side, it's very lonely because there's still no certainty that DoD wants to buy what you're selling as a service. So then you're left in the cold. And that's my scenario where I'm saying you can't afford your mortgage and your business still can't survive. Because more important than even that down payment, I would say when you buy a house is that you can sustain that for decades. For 30 years, you could pay that mortgage. And I feel like that is where DoD often just really hasn't figured it out yet, especially for new technologies, new things that don't fit into the requirement, which I don't think it necessarily always does. The Henry Ford quote, if people asked me what they wanted, they would just say faster horses.
Right.
I'm sure most people would not have said they wanted the iPhone in 2006.
Mhm.
But guess what? They bought it. But that's
Exactly.
not how DoD works. DoD would say, sorry, that wasn't part of our requirements. We can't buy it. So again, I feel like sometimes DoD isn't a good buyer. And that goes back to, I think, to your point too, to the requirements process. I'll get off my soapbox.
No, absolutely.
How do
Like, oh, go ahead, Tom.
No, I was just gonna joke. How do you really feel, Clayton? No,
I just
here,
think they
here.
need to show that there's, I phrase it, money, recurring revenue for companies on the table. And a lot of times, if they could figure out how to do that well, I think, Winnie, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if they could figure out how to do that well, that would satisfy a lot of private investors to say, yes, we want to invest in this because they're going to buy it. Again, this is how it works
Exactly.
commercially. That's the part that I still feel like DoD hasn't quite figured out.
Exactly. If I were to put myself in the shoes of private investors like venture capitalists, is when they're evaluating an opportunity to invest in a company, they look at they assess the market risk as well as the technology risk. Right? So technology risk is like, okay, well, is this going to work? And they got their own way of figuring that out, and also the company can demonstrate the technology, the feasibility of the technology. But when it comes to market risk, right? Like what they look for is like signals that after, the company develops the technology that there's going to be a buyer.
Right.
Exactly. And
It's
I think
important.
it's so important, right? Because then you're helping the company like de-risk their market risk, and therefore it makes them a lot more attractive to private investors.
Yeah, and taking this one step further, I think for you it's interesting because in some ways you are a square peg that fits in the square hole of the DoD requirements process. You do space launch. They have space access. This is not something new to DoD. They have bought that commercially for a long time now. What I think is interesting about what you're doing is that on top of that, you can bake in new, not just maybe new capabilities, but new missions, new space missions. And those only work when DoD really looks beyond just launch and sees those things that kind of get layered on top of what you're doing. So it's interesting that you too kind of have to play in that new mission, new capability area to really see what's out there. And that's really how I think you're going to grow into these different use cases, but it's not all on you. It's going to be on the ability of DoD to accept these other things that maybe they don't have in the, it's not a square peg to fit in the square hole. It's a triangle, or it's a triangle, or it's a star shaped peg. So like that part that also ties back to the requirements process, I think. And I hate to keep bringing it back to that. And I'm not saying like dump the requirements process, but it's just not set up like people buy things nor how businesses buy things. And that is, I think, the biggest blocker for DoD taking advantage of innovations.
For sure. And I think there's two ways this can go, right? One is like, hey, what you want, and you can put out the requirements. But going back to your like iPhone example, right? Like, Steve Jobs and go around asking people like, what they wanted to come up with the iPhone, right? Like he also like had the vision to be able to see, hey, this is what consumers are gonna like. That's how we decided to build the iPhone. So in our case, it's similar, right? We are also doing quite a bit of advocacy. Thankfully, like we're able to go out and speak to members of the Space Force, Air Force, like missile defense, and the other services. Now they're genuinely interested in like what we're working on. And when they can see, once you have a conversation with them, then it sparks, like it lights up a
Right.
light bulb.
Yep.
Actually, then they can, it fuels their imagination.
Yeah, I think that's the best way. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. It's just a lot of these things that we're talking about or that we see on the horizon, it's just really limited by our imagination and the imagination of leaders in the military, decision makers, policymakers. I don't think it's an issue with industry, with companies, with people who have ideas that aren't in government. I think it's how they can see that vision, and then again, I think it really is about buying it and how they figure out how to put money into that so it happens. Because if they don't do that, it's even if they put in the R&D money, I'm still like, if you can't find a way to really put money on the table on a recurring basis, it's just not going to work in the long term.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Because like we're building companies to again be successful and profitable, right? So we're not just here to be an R&D shop, like
Right, over
we're not.
time too, in a sustained
Exactly.
basis.
Yeah. One of the interesting charts I've seen in the last few years that's been floating around is showing the reversal of where does R&D or like seed money come from. You go back to like 50, 70 years, it was 80% federal government, maybe some state government money funding labs and funding whatever, and then the 20% private sector. And now it's the inverse. And it's kind of interesting here, Clayton, your points, and when you talk about this, it's like we have more energy and resources flowing from the private sector to the private sector in developing these really cool cutting edge technologies. And increasingly, the government is a marginal investor and to a certain degree, marginal buyer of some of these really cutting edge services. And I think the government struggles in that environment where both on the, I'm no longer the predominant funder, so I don't get to drive the agenda and the requirements. On the other hand, I really can only afford to be a marginal or partial buyer of that market.
Yeah.
It's sustained only so far. And I think about this now, like you come from the tech sector and obviously doing pretty cutting edge stuff and now the space sector. It feels like there is so much amazing development and activity and innovation that's going on. Do we have, this might be like the ultimate luxury, but do we have a national surplus of like innovative companies that like the government struggles to, it's so in vogue to say like keep up with, but in reality, like facilitate or enableize, because there's just so much happening, particularly in the space domain right now. You could probably say the same in the tech domain as well, but it's happening so fast in so many really cool capabilities that people didn't dream of 10 years ago are happening all together at once. And it's really hard to sustain all that.
Yeah, and you bring up a point which is, you know, federal federal funding, that's been allocated to space over time, right? The fraction has gone down significantly. I think if we look at the government, like what is the role of the government, right? Is it like a capital allocator of to private companies? Maybe not, right? But it can certainly probably not, right? Yeah, exactly. So
I don't
probably
think so.
yeah,
That's just me.
yeah, exactly. So that's all right. But I think it's just sending like stronger signals on what it needs, what it's looking to purchase. And I think you can also perhaps like facilitate some funding programs. There's what is it? The Office of Strategic Capital is providing loans or about to provide loans to companies that's developing technologies that's critical for national security. I think continuing to lean on these programs, is a good strategy, because then you're matching private investments with the support or guarantee with some with
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good happening within the Pentagon too on commercial and space. I mean, I'll give him a shout out what Colonel Rich Nisley's doing in Space Force. I think he's trying to build a budget to buy things differently. I think that's really hard. It's hard within the Pentagon, but then it's also an issue for Congress to really have to make a decision on where to put that money, where to appropriate money to do stuff a little differently. I think some of this is probably not much of a worry to you because I think you are in that sweet spot where they do buy things commercially, but you're doing it in a different way that it's not. I think there are still opportunities for you that are different than if you were ULA or you were SpaceX with the Falcon 9. I think it looks slightly different.
for sure.
Something, Clayton, just go ahead, Winnie. Sorry.
Oh, no, yeah. No, I was just gonna say it's also like the government's like recognizing that small companies can move fast and innovate much quicker.
Yeah.
Yep. So if at the end of the day we want to feel cutting edge technology, then we need the support and also the involvement of small, nimble businesses.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, there's this switch towards, you think about it, up until maybe the last 20 years, the government always bought hardware. The only services they really bought were, people to come in and, kind of staff things where they needed extra non-federal employees or military. But now so much of space is being sold as a service. And obviously, I imagine that's what you're selling too. So it's sort of the commoditization of access or delivery, and that can cut both ways because I think about in the fighter jet, you're buying a jet. Yeah, you're buying some services that go along and enable that, but ultimately you're buying an asset that's got a multi-decadal thing. In reality, differentiating between the technologies, like something as cutting edge and innovative as what you're doing versus if we're just going price per kilogram to orbit, differentiating between buying services that way, it gets kind of interesting because it'd be really easy to just go, I'll be a marginal buyer on Starship. So how do you win that game on innovation if it is sort of race towards lowest cost delivery?
That's what I talked about, like value proposition, which is like, hey, there's more to it than just cost, right? There's a reason why we don't buy the cheapest car, right? There are other value adds and other factors that factor into your decision making. As for being asset light, right? I mean, like I think Uber is a good example. Right, Uber, Airbnb, these are all very successful tech companies, multi-billion-dollar market cap, and yet they don't own any assets. So I think like the idea of being a service-only business is viable. You can do it. And I think it's just all comes back to the business. Like, the business needs to account for, maintenance of hardware. It needs to, account for the CapEx costs. But at the end of the day, like, you can make a business very successful by just offering services.
Yeah, I mean, airlines are a great example of that. I mean, there's a lot. Yeah, It's really cool. It's really interesting to see both the technology and the business model and the way that both the commercial market and the government market interacts with that happening so quickly. We've had your, I think the third really like cool cutting edge CEO doing really innovative stuff we've had on the show, which has been fun to have these conversations in things that even when I go back to like the wave of commercial space companies 10, 15 years ago, the stuff you're doing wasn't even imagined. We had Astroforge, we had Varda. I think it's a testament to the caliber of the guests we're bringing on the show and the companies that are doing. But there are things that, you go back 5 years ago didn't exist. And it's a really cool time to be watching this all play out.
Absolutely. Like, it's such an exciting time to be alive, right?
Yeah.
I just like in some ways I feel like this is a space race. We get
Yeah.
to live it. I wasn't around during the first space race, but it's just so exciting. Like, it was and competition spurs innovation. In the 60s, we it was competition between the nations, and now I would say it's still a competition with the nations, but with like private companies involved. Right? So I'm just incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to participate in this next competition. Also, at the same time, I think what's really changed is people's mentality towards working in hardware, first of all, but also, acceptance on working on like defense programs. I think like even 10 years ago, like saying that you're working on a defense program could like lead to some rolling eyes at dinner parties, but nowadays it's like perfectly accepted. So what this means is like I think the next generation of talent we're going to see graduating from university and colleges, like they're going to be a lot more receptive to working on these big problems, big meaningful problems that have a consequence for the history of the country. So it's very meaningful work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think about just a year or two ago, like South by Southwest, the music festival and everything else festival, kicked out all the defense contractors from being there. And I almost feel like today people would be like, no, no, we want you all here. This is where our stakeholders want to go work and invest in and be a part of. So I feel like, yeah, that part of culture and industry is changing
Yeah,
so fast.
totally agree. Totally agree on that point. Like, I was at South by Southwest this year, and I was just amazed, like, by the participation at the defense, like, focused events. I mean, it was packed, right? Like to your point, like a few years ago, I can imagine, a music event hosting DoD, related events. Just couldn't imagine that.
Well, thank you for making the defense sector cool again. It's nice to be proud and helping increase our brand. Well, we like to wrap up. I know we're pushing the end of the hour, but with a couple lightning round questions, just some fun ones to kind of close out, and then we do this day in space history, where Professor Swope talks us through big milestones in space. We have a big one this week, an annually big one. But I guess a couple things. So, favorite space experience you've had in your career, whether it's a launch or meeting an astronaut or scientist, anything stand out to you?
Going to my first space launch, rocket launch at Cape Canaveral. It was the Atlas V rocket. I was sitting in the bleachers. Yep, and I forget which launch pad. Was it 39B? I forget which one it was. Anyways, don't quote me on that. But yeah, it was like seeing the rocket take off from the launch pad,
Yeah,
but not just
that's
like
cool.
seeing it, but feeling the vibration from the rocket motors. That was a surreal experience.
That's awesome. Well, we talked about sending suborbital astronauts into space. Would you yourself, maybe perhaps not on an Auriga system right now, would you, if offered by Mr. Bezos or Mr. Branson, Sir Richard Branson, would you do it?
Or I'd
Very
say
excited.
Mars too. I want to throw that in too.
Oh, you're
Okay,
going to say
Tom's
Mars, I'm not
question,
sure.
but
Okay.
also if someone says we're recruiting people to go on the first human landing on Mars, would you raise your hand to do that? So it's two different questions. Sorry.
Okay,
We
okay. The
we
first
just
one is a
expended two
resounding yes.
questions.
The suborbital flight, a resounding yes, of course. It's been proven safe, and it seems like the prep work is minimal. Whereas I think going to Mars would require a lot more training. Quite frankly, I'm not sure if I'm the best candidate for that. I think there are probably like younger people that are more physically resilient than I am to go to Mars.
And Clayton would know, how many miles of track do we need on Mars to get back to Earth? Still 6? Or are we talking
I don't
talking
know.
12
To get back to Earth,
to get back to Earth?
there's less gravity and less atmosphere, but we still probably need a lot
We need
lot
some
lot of
boost.
mileage there. It'd be a
Yeah.
long ski jump.
Yeah. So cool.
All right, one more for me, and then unless Clayton, you got any. So we got a big asteroid, suddenly planetary protection perks up. It's coming to Earth. Are you all on call to do the deflection mission? Is that in our future here, where you become what was the movie Armageddon and Deep Impact? You're the delivery system of our salvation.
We haven't gotten a call about it, but if we got a call about it, I think, there could be ways that we could help out.
Yeah,
There is a
excellent.
planetary defense office at NASA.
Yeah.
I don't know if they have a lot of money to do side projects, or not side projects, a project.
No, this is the
should
real.
not be a
This is
side
the whole
project.
project.
This is
Yeah.
it. This is the thing. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, when you talk about an hourly capability, I want lots of shots on goal as that thing's coming towards us. I don't want to launch a thing and wait 3 days and see if it worked. I want to keep throwing things at it on your system and just, keep pinging it until it.
And not to be a wet blanket, but like I see an awesome counter space weapon here as well. So I have my own opinions about things like that and weapons in space and space weapons, the weapons from space. But to me, that's a good selling point, just as good as the planetary defense. You're just shooting at a satellite and not an asteroid that's threatening humankind. Fiction.
Yeah, exactly. What I'll say is like we're not working on those projects, but we're keeping an eye out on the latest development.
Clayton, you got
All
any
right.
more? We're getting history.
No, we could do history.
Let's do
So
it.
not today. It was the 12th, but April 12th, 1961 was when Yuri Gagarin went to space. First human being in space was a Russian, Vostok 1. Mission lasted 108 minutes. According to what I'm reading, it opened the door to the future exploration of the cosmos. Two other things that I thought kind of were interesting. Apollo 16, it took off. It launched today. It was the 10th. Let's see, the 10th crewed mission. How was that possible? 10th crewed mission in the Apollo program? Maybe it
Yeah,
was.
because
Maybe it was the
they
10th.
did some Leo-based ones and Apollo 8.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I guess so. I assume 16, did it land on the moon? Yeah, it landed on the moon.
It did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't this the famous one where John Young, did he bring the golf club?
It was John Young. So
Yeah.
it must have been.
Oh, okay.
That's
You
the
just
golf
referenced it
ball that
earlier. This is
we
a
talked about
famous golf
earlier.
ball. Yeah. Iconic. And Ken Mattingly finally got to fly after being sidelined
He
on
was
Apollo
the
13.
command module pilot is what
That's right.
I see. So that was today, though. So that was actually today. And then tomorrow, I thought this was interesting because I remember this movie. I don't know if I was a kid. I mean, I think Tom and I were about the same age. I think you're a little
Yeah, we're
younger than
about
me.
the same.
Winnie, you're probably younger than me. But Apollo 13, the movie with Tom Hanks, Apollo 13 splashdown, April 17th, 1970. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. All right.
I don't know when that movie came out. I probably had it on
It was
DVD.
in the 90s. I want it was the mid
90s,
90s.
late
It was amazing.
90s.
Okay, 90s. Yeah, okay. So I was,
An amazing
high
soundtrack. If
school.
you ever just need to get inspired while you're like staying up
Oh.
late working on the space project, pop on the Apollo 13 soundtrack.
I could probably find my DVD for you if you want it, Tom. I'll let you borrow it. And
Oh,
I'll let
yeah,
you borrow a DVD player too, if you want. Well, that's all I had. That's all the history I got. That was a lot. That was a lot this week.
These are big
In
ones.
space.
Yeah.
We had 1 week. It was like the space shuttle got close to the Mir space station. It
For the
wasn't even
first
like the
time.
real mission.
Didn't
It
even
was
dock
like
with it. No, it
we're
just got close.
scraping the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah. And close was probably like 100 kilometers. I don't know.
So in honor of
That's
you,
insane.
we broke out the big guns.
It was big news. Yeah, big news this week.
Yeah. That wraps up our show. Winnie, thank you so much for being on. We really enjoyed talking to you. We'll look forward to following your success and the milestones to come, and hope to have you back on as you get there.
Oh, well, hey, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks again. We'll see you next time.